Chapter 3, Adopted by Indians, A True Story by Thomas Jefferson Mayfield. Chapter 3, Meeting the Indians. After several days of plunging through the tule reeds and mud and swimming and fording sloughs, we came out on a rolling, sloped country. Traveling eastward, across this plain, through the same wildflowers we had seen to the west, we finally encountered a trail, or what was really a wandering wagon road. Upon meeting several horsemen who were traveling along the road, we found that it led to the Fremont Mines at Las Mariposas, where, as Las Mariposas were called then. We traveled to our destination with the horsemen we had met. Here's a map. Let's see. So this is a map of the San Joaquin River, but they are right now, let's see if we can draw that on here. This is where they landed. This is San Francisco. They traveled down through San Jose, and now they're traveling this way. So I don't think they've gotten to the river. Or they did get to the river and they crossed it. My daddy was disappointed in the Fremont mines. He had always lived in an unsettled country, and at the mines he found a great crowd of miners racing around, buying and selling claims and doing some mining. Everything for miles around was staked, so he decided to move farther south. At this time there had been no rush of miners south of Las Mariposas, and we started south to the San Joaquin River, where it flows westward from the Sierra. So here is where they're headed. This is the Sierra, and this is the river heading to the west. Here the bank of the river was quite high, and the water about 100 yards across. A large group of Indians, numbering probably 40, were bathing in the south edge of the stream. As I remember, the group was composed mostly of young people, and they all appeared very much excited at seeing our party, but did not seem afraid of us. We sat on our horses a while and watched the bathers. Some of them were washing their hair. They would lean over, allowing their long hair to fall forward into the water. Then they would comb it with their fingers. They soon became too deeply interested in us to go on with their bathing, and several of them swam to our side of the river. By this time we had dismounted and were trying to decide whether to attempt a crossing there or to follow the north bank of the river toward the hills. My daddy found one of the Indians could understand a little Spanish, and this Indian encouraged him to cross the river, saying that his people would help us. So actually they're not up here, they're down here. So we made preparations to ferry the river, and as we had done before when crossing the valley. Here's a picture of the river. This is Tule. While the animals were being unpacked, I stayed near my mother, and she kept close watch over me, as 8 or 10 of the Indians were crowding about, looking at me excitedly, talking to one another. Finally, a young girl about 16 years of age offered to take me on her back and swim the river with me. Here's another picture. It's quite wide. Where they're crossing is wider than this. At this, my mother took me in her arms and held me close to her, motioning for the Indians to go away. She called to my daddy, and he ran to us, thinking that some hostile move had been made. He soon saw that the Indians were all right and told my mother to let the girl carry me across, as I would be safer in her arms than I would be on one of our horses. So my mother took off my clothes and put me on the back of the Indian girl. I clasped my hands around her neck, and she took my feet under her arms and waded into the water. Soon she started swimming with a long overhand stroke. She was as slippery as could be, and I was afraid of being carried away by the current, and clung to her neck so closely that she could not breathe. Several times she stopped swimming and reached up and pulled my arms down until she recovered her breath. Then she started on again, until we arrived at the south edge of the stream in shallow water. She stood me in the water, which was about a foot deep, near a sandbar. During this time, all of the Indian women and children from the rancheria had accumulated where we were about to land, and they crowded around me and laughed and talked to each other about me and called me Choweechip, little white boy. I did not know their language then, but I have always felt sure that they were also telling each other how cute I was. The girl who had carried me across the river was very proud of me, and holding my hand kept the rest of the Indians at a distance of several feet. She would talk to me and laugh, but of course I understood nothing she said and remembered only the words I mentioned before. After we had crossed the river, we spent several hours at the rancheria. Then we packed our animals again and traveled several miles upstream before we made camp. During the entire distance, we were accompanied by a large group of Indians from the rancheria. After dark, they left, but were back in the morning before sunrise with acorn bread and fresh meat for us. The next day, after leaving the Indians, we proceeded up the river. There, we found a couple of white men building a ferry. My daddy decided to stay there for a while and prospect the sand in the river. He soon found that there was some gold in it and built a long flume and sluice box of split logs in which to wash the sand. That would look like this. During this time, we were camped on a sandbar above the level of the river. About that time, my daddy had his sluice box done. We had several days of real hot weather. It must have been the 1st of July. There had been some discussion about high water, but we were not alarmed. I believed that the Indians had told us that there would be a flood. However, we made no preparations to move, as we felt that we were perfectly safe where we were. The Indians still kept in touch with us and brought us meat and bread. This we used almost entirely, as we did not have a large supply of our own, and it was a long trip to Stockton, the nearest large city, for more. They also made us a present of a fine bow and half a dozen arrows. Let's look and see where they are. Here they are down here. And Stockton is a city way up here. This is a really far way to walk. One afternoon, while playing on the ferry boat, an Indian about my own age, I slipped and fell in the water. I could not swim and, of course, immediately went under. When I came up, the Indian boy was lying on his stomach with the upper part of his body hanging over the edge of the boat. I would surely have drowned if it had not been for him. He was not as big as I was, but he could swim like a fish. He grabbed me by the hair and towed me around the edge of the boat to shallow water where I could wade to shore. It was a narrow escape, and I have never forgotten that Indian boy. I knew him for many years afterward. His name was Kunansi, and he belonged to the tribe Dumna that had a rancheria near where the town of Millerton was later located. One afternoon, I had been shooting at a mark on the sandbar below our camp with my bow and arrows. I left them out there overnight. During the night, we awakened and found several inches of water within our tent. The river was rising rapidly, and we rushed about in the dark, working hard to save our equipment and supplies. The thing that worried me the most was my bow and arrows. I waded around in the water looking for them, but was unable to find them, as they had been carried away before our tent was flooded. While I was looking for them, the folks missed me and began a search for me. I soon appeared, and they were glad to see me, but made me stay with our pile of equipment high up on the riverbank. The next morning, we were a discouraged family. We had lost part of our supplies, and the flume and sluice box were entirely gone. No one had known anything about conditions on the river except the Indians, and no one had paid any attention to what they had said. We camped on the bank of the river for several days. The water rose high above where we had been camped on the sandbar. During this time, we learned from the Indians that the river would be much as it was then until late in the summer. By this time, about 20 Americans had gathered about the ferry and were prospecting and surrounding the country. After much discussion, my daddy decided that he would move farther south and make a permanent settlement on Kings River. He had been over there a few weeks previous to our being flooded out and liked the country on Kings River very much. He said he'd had enough of mining. My daddy wanted to raise horses and cattle. He decided that a foothill location would place him close to the Free Valley feed grazing during the spring and also the later mountain feed during the summer. I believe that this was the same reason that many of the first settlers in the valley selected foothill locations. In many places, the valley plains furnished free grazing, which is where cattle would eat, until the late 1870s. So we packed up and traveled south again until we arrived at the north bank of the Kings River. We followed the north bank to the first good-sized stream flowing into it from the north. There, on the point of land formed by Kings River on the south and Sycamore Creek on the east, we made camp again. This is a picture of the San Joaquin River and King River. And I'm not sure where the Sycamore Creek is. Oh, here it is. So they went from here down to here. And on this California map is in around this area. So we are here. They went all the way down there. Let's see. There were many fine oak trees nearby. Sycamore Creek contained plenty of water and fish, and we felt sure that it would have running water in it all summer. If the water in Sycamore Creek should fail, then we would have Kings River nearby. My daddy and my brothers, John and Ben, felled a tall oak tree and split it into shakes or shingles. And from these shakes, they built a 2-room shanty, which is a little tiny house. The roof and sides were entirely of shakes. They also built a large stone fireplace. We now had a real home.